Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to another Sonic Lab presentation. It's our kind of periodical dip into what's up at Bitwig. And Bitwig have actually just released a major new update, which is version 3.3, which, according to my notes, is their 14th update. Isn't that right, Mr. Dave Lindenbank of Bitwig? How are you?
That is correct. Hello, Nick. Good to see you today.
So you're in Berlin, in the Berlin HQ, where you have a fine pedigree. I have to ask you, are those IKEA shoe shelves that are being repurposed as, I forget the name of them, as synth stands?
I can neither confirm or deny that. So.
Excellent. Yeah. So, Dave, what are we looking at first? I mean, because there are some major new features in this version, which goes out to all people who are subscribed and have the update plan. So, maybe you could run us through what we're going to see.
Yeah. Let's just do a little bit of a walkthrough. I mean, 3.3 has come, and a lot of it is focused on a kind of a reinterpretation of modular. We've always been built modularly between how you work in different projects, how you can access different devices. We do have the fully modular grid environment, but it's nice to start in a more direct place sometimes. So we kind of made a hybrid modular synth called Polymer that uses some of the grid technology, but puts you in a more streamlined place for making some quicker sound design decisions. So I've got a little session here. Maybe we can play it for a moment just to see what's going on. So we can already see on this first track, I've got this bass going on here, and this is using Polymer as it is. So just with it in place, what you basically have are three different slots. So start by saying, I'm picking an oscillator, I'm picking a filter, I'm picking an envelope generator. So there are choices for switching around and dealing with modular in this fashion, where the decisions have been made, as many of the parameters will be mapped when you switch over as possible, and we'll see that in action. So if I just take this as a sound design example to begin with, I mean, it's a bass part. I can go ahead and hit play. Now, if I want to beef it up a little bit, there's different ways to approach it. It's a pulse wave. Maybe that's okay for now. But I do have filters here, so maybe I'll try switching to a different model filter. And so even if I'm not on the technical side of this, I'm realizing this model is preserving a lot more of the bass to begin with. Well, what else might you want to do? Just things for quick access. This little gain parameter, well, on a filter, gain tends to mean drive. So maybe we push it a little bit. Or maybe even with this somewhat cryptic but interesting icon over here, some phase modulation. So if I turn this up. So something a bit different and growly already, where it's just quick access because we're trying to pick the parameters that you might need and put them together so that you can swap things around in a direct fashion.
So is this kind of built within the kind of modular grid, but skinned to kind of give a kind of clearer set of macros, or is it a device in its own right, if you see what I mean?
It's a device in its own right. It's just using the grid technology. We've already made a bunch of oscillators, a bunch of filters. They're all oversampled. They're all doing interesting things. So giving them a different presentational look and a different way that you can access them quickly. All the modulation routings are still going to work the same. So if you're coming from that side, everything's the same here. It just, sometimes it helps to limit what you're making choices about. So this just gives you a more direct access to basically, I mean, if I look at the panel here, I've got those three slots, but outside of that, there's just a few things. So, a sub. So if I'm playing a note, I'm blending between regular oscillator and just the sub down an octave or two. I've got some noise to mix in. I've got a filter envelope generator, which does its own thing, or a little button to say, well, maybe I want to use that to also envelope the sub and the noise as well. And then a high pass on the way out. So with some of these sounds, we'll look at the different ones and where these parameters might come into play. But it's basically, a structured device that has a particular level of support, but still just trying to keep the streamlined interface.
And it's is this mono, poly? What's the kind of voice count and CPU load and stuff like?
Well, like everything, it's whatever you want it to be. So right now it's mono. But if I went ahead and said I want 6 voices instead, or I want to turn on voice stacking, like all of the Bitwig stuff is still in here. So,
right.
so yeah, it's starting mono, but it is poly because, yeah, you just flip the button. So there's one example with the bass thing. If we switch over to a different sound. So
That's interesting.
in this case, yeah, just gliding around a little bit with the way we've got our pitch modulations or our micro pitch expressions that you can have. So right now, this is just being driven with a sawtooth, standard parameter controls. You know, I've got a little bit of stereo detuning going on because that's available and built in. But maybe I want to try something other than sawtooth. Maybe I want to try sine. Okay. Can even shape it, but that's a little bit weak. Maybe try triangle with some of these shaping. So you can take it very different places. I kind of like sawtooth, but okay, totally different flavor. How about a swarm oscillator?
Oh yeah, that's nice.
Narrow it a little bit. So now a stack of 8 sawtooths that are all going with a little bit of unison action to them. And like we normally do with the modulation system, I've got a little step sequencer here. Maybe I just need to bring it in to alter things a bit. So yeah, just a different angle here, looking at some of the oscillators and the ability to switch between them and maintaining all of these settings and the routings that are going on.
Nice.
So if we were to go down, what else do we have here? So a fairly reasonable sound, pretty simple. But one thing I want to look at in just the sense of how is this a patch? How is it relating to itself? What's the architecture of the device? So I'm adjusting frequency, but I'm not really hearing that. Because I've got this strange little button here. We have these icons, all these pre-chords within the grid telling you, oh, you just want to enable retrigger every time you play a note. You don't want to have to patch it up. Well, in this case, it's saying, we're going to retrigger and create hard sync based on the sub oscillator. So while this is on, the sub is determining the frequency. If I turn that off, it's probably going to be a little crazy. Yeah. That doesn't sound right.
Well, it's still quite nice though.
We can make that track a little later. But yeah, once you've got these functions here, so what actually is going on? Maybe it would be nice to have a schematic view of the patch. So like a lot of our devices, there is an expanded device view, and it will indeed show you the grid patch that is underneath all of this, because it is actually creating this and maintaining it and keeping it along the way. So 2 different reasons. I might want to access this just to grab some of the parameters that didn't make it onto the front panel, some of the detail controls, like changing the color of the noise, or maybe changing the curve of the frequency envelope generator. You know, there's some detail parameters that are here. These are all modulatable. You can control them if you want. This isn't to take away from the streamline point. It's just to put everything else out there as available. Now, I could, if I wanted, say, well, let's flip Polymer and turn this into a grid patch. But again, for my money, I would take a different approach. I would say, okay, I like what's here. If I want another oscillator or another filter, maybe I'll use the Bitwig standard way of looking at modular before we start digging into the grid, because that's just a different mindset. So I'm going to start with this Polymer. I'm going to go ahead and grab it. I'm just going to do a Command-G on Mac to put it into an instrument layer, and then maybe I'll do a Command-D to duplicate. And now I suddenly have 2 different copies of Polymer So if I leave the first one as is, for the second one, let's just do something else altogether. Maybe put on the sine, maybe even turn off the arpeggiator. Maybe use some phase modulation here. Ah, that comb filter, he's doing everything.
Interesting.
Ah, that's why he's still modulating. There we go. We're still in crazy frequency town. There we go. So now if I wanted, I could treat this second one totally separate. Even just say, oh, well, yeah, keep the arpeggiator, but maybe put him on triplets, you know?
Ah, okay. So that's interesting. So the Bitwig approach, like you're saying, is a question of just layering up devices much more freely rather than thinking I'm stuck with the structure of a single instrument.
Oh, exactly. You know, sometimes you're going to want two oscillators or a different filter or a different structure. But with a simple structure, being able to multiply it or scale it or just have different copies you can switch between, there's another way before you go into like patch chord land. That's all.
Right. I've got you. Okay. Understood.
That's all. So
interesting.
We've got one last little example here that might be worth it. So here, one of the oscillators that is newly arrived that wasn't in the grid before is a wavetable oscillator. So this is part of Polymer, just like it's a grid module. If you wanted to load a Serum or WaveEdit compatible wave file, you can just drop it onto the oscillator and it'll make sense of it and load it. It uses the Surge format, the WT format, so if other programs use that format, you can load those files directly as well. But for the sake of having something to work with, we've included, I believe, 120-something wavetable files already. So if I've got this, we'll just let the notes play. So if I click on the wavetable, I have this visual browser that's built into everything already. So if I just want to switch,
can you automate the switching of wavetables, or is that something you have to do manually?
No, you can't automate this. Again, we could do two different layers and crossfade between them. Or whatnot,
yeah, okay, but, yeah. There's a way around.
Yeah, no, this part takes a little bit of disk operation, so it's not instantaneous. But so even if I'm just playing, we have the index control, because obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, if you want to do wavetable synthesis, you usually want to modulate it with something. You want to move it over time. So that index control is there by default, and then it can be targeted with any of these parameters. One of these modulators, by the way, I should mention, that's been sitting over here, is a nice little vibrato modulator, which is quite simple, but it's something that got added here because, again, if we're talking about saving you 3 or 4 or 5 clicks every time to get to a sound, this is part of the default patch in Polymer, where it just takes, it's an LFO made for vibrato and normaled, in this case, to mod wheel. So if I bring the mod wheel up or down on my controller, it's just automatically mapped. If you're an MPE person, maybe you want to do poly pressure, that's an option also, so that each note you've got, however hard you hold it. Yeah, so a few things have come along the way just to support this and make it doable. Now, we mentioned that this could go into polygrid if we really wanted, so maybe I go back to the bass sound for a minute to do something simple. Just a quick example. I've got Polymer. If I simply right-click on the edge of it, I can convert to polygrid. And we're done. Sounds the same as before, but now it's an actual polygrid patch. So again, you know, to me, interesting patches start simple and they do something interesting as opposed to becoming incredibly complex. So in this case, I was trying to fatten this up before. Maybe it's just a question of, oh, well, there aren't any wave shapers. Let's go into the shaper category. Maybe drag a distortion right before the filter and let go. Maybe modulate it with each filter. Let's try it after the filter instead. Yeah, it's a lot harder, like you would expect.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Again, there might be a time and a place to go in and start throwing different modules together or copying and pasting things back and forth. But in this case, a lot of the time Polymer might be enough, and it's a good place to start.
Excellent. I mean, what's the CPU load like? Because obviously, I mean, this is a sort of the options here are fantastical. You know, when you get into the polygrid and then breaking out these instruments into their component parts. I mean, is there a difference in if you're just running a straight Polymer or convert to grid? Is there a difference in the amount of grunt it requires to do that, or is it irrelevant?
No, it's negligible. I mean, it has a lot more to do with what you set for polyphony and mono and those kinds of settings. But it's pretty much running the same thing. And like the rest of Bitwig, including the grid, the way we've made it is optimized. So once you start up this, it looks at your processor, compiles our code to run the way your processor likes to do math the best to get better efficiency, and then it runs a little bit better. So it really is taking all of those things into account as much as we can.
Neat. So there are some other features in this upgrade, right? So, I mean, I guess workflow stuff. I mean, you must be tweaking the workflow every time you come around to it as well, right?
Yeah, indeed. So I'll switch over to this other section for a moment where we've got some arranger things in view. One thing that's always been at the center of what Bitwig does, we just have this idea about preserving transients whenever you're editing. Because a lot of the time, it's easy to lose those sorts of things when you start applying fades and other deals. So I've got two audio clips here together. If I just click and drag, now this is how things have been for a long time. It might be confusing at first to see that the crossfade is coming before the edit, because we just have this priority on saying, if you've placed an edit, that's probably where the sound change should be, and not the middle of a transition going on. So just from kind of this philosophy, we've cleaned this up a little bit in terms of how to handle adjusting lengths, adjusting things between audio. One interesting thing, the ability to actually just grab the region overlap and slide both of them together. But in that transient preservation idea, here's one simple but pretty powerful new idea. If I had this edited right up at the beginning of the wave, it's one thing to drag in and say, oh, I'm fading from the edit point, and now obviously the beginning of your audio is quieter. But sometimes you want to fade from before. So now we have this pre-fade idea where you can basically drag in the other direction. Yeah, maybe that has more material to look at. So that it actually will just say, oh, well, we know there's audio underneath. Now we're fading up to the point where you've placed that edit. So you're not going to, again, lose any transient or anything like that.
It's subtle, though, because when you're moving and you're snapping parts on a grid, you want that kind of pre-fade transient preservation, don't you? Could you use it for things like, a breath into a vocal or a pickup? Is there a length is there a maximum length that can happen, or is it designed for very small amounts?
If you do auto fades, they tend to be very small because it's thinking in this anti-click sense, but the length is up to you. You could draw it as long as you want.
Right.
And similar, like with this crossfade that we just created over here. So now, because of this idea, what would you expect if you actually separate two things that are crossfaded? Well, you probably want to maintain the sound. So now, in a very literal sense, you can kind of see it's exactly fading out where it was fading out. There's just nothing fading in top. And on the other one, it's actually fading in where it was fading in. And it's preserving all of this instead of trying to recalculate everything. So
that is subtle, but actually that's quite a powerful distinction, I think.
It's hopefully interesting for our audio editing friends. Yeah. So one thing there, in a similar way, if I were to grab a region of notes over here, Now, if I select a number of nodes, there is the ability in a couple different ways to freely scale content within the timeline. So if I just hold Alt and grab on the edge of whatever I've selected, I'm now automatically scaling the time of everything. Or if I were to actually grab on an event, now you can see it's just scaling the individual events together. So we're just kind of trying to refine easier ways to handle this. And by the same token, it could even be automation that I've got, and I just do some kind of time selection, and now you could freely scale anything.
That notion of pre-fade business, does that work with MIDI patterns as well? So sometimes you might want to bring a fade up into a point, but you want the fade to start before. Do you see what I mean? So you have the quantized point, and then you have the pattern, so that when it would snap to the quantized point rather than the pre.
I see what you're saying. With the audio, it worked. The fades apply to audio here.
Right.
So if we're dealing with notes, you would just want to do a volume automation, basically.
Right. Okay, got you. Okay, Dave, so that's some of the features of the new Bitwig release. So how do people get hold of it?
Well, version 3.3 is out and available today. So if you have an active upgrade plan for our current users, then you already get this version. For anyone else, it's available. You can go to bitwig.com, download the demo, and try out all the features right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for showing us the new features, and I hope everything's all right for you guys in Berlin. I look forward to seeing you in person real soon.
That would be lovely. Let's all look forward to that day. Thanks, Nick.